Hi, this is Scott Sustachek, your host for CEO to CEO, the podcast from the CEO Roundtable. CEO Roundtable is a peer-to-peer organization that brings business leaders together to share wisdom, experience, and insights from the trenches. Today's episode is sponsored by IntroWorks, launching powerful B2B brands for more than 30 years. Learn more about them at intro.works. This is Scott Sustachek with the latest episode of CEO to CEO, and I've got a fantastic guest with me today, Tom Henrich, CEO of Eagle Aluminum. Tom, welcome.
Great to be on, Scott.
Glad you could make it here with us because I think from the time we met, which was probably a little over a year ago, your story about how you came out of a completely different industry and went about building an acquisition playbook and buying a business because you wanted to be a business owner is so intriguing. And I think it's something that our audience really would like to hear. And I think especially those companies that are focused on doing acquisitions need to hear, because you took a very investment banker-like approach to this whole thing, and then you became an operator on the backside of it. I want to just, before we get too deep into this, though, I want to talk a little bit about your background. You come from a Cargill background where you were in engineering and operations, then some time at Boston Consulting Group, and again, focusing on industrial and med tech spaces. And then you launched your search. You said, hey, I want to go out and own a company. And I think that's what we want to hear about today, is more about the Tom Henrich story and how you went about this.
Sure. So it sounds a little bit more planned out than it probably was in practice when you say it like that. But I'd say I'd been exposed to people in small and medium-sized businesses from a pretty early age, whether it was family members or family friends. So it was always something that I'd had in the back of my head as something I'd be interested in doing later on in life and during my career. But as you mentioned, I graduated from undergrad with a chemical engineering degree. I went and worked for Cargill for a period of time in engineering and operations roles, and then went to grad school where I was first exposed to the idea that you could kind of set out in a targeted manner and look for small and mid-sized companies to purchase. So when I was exiting there, I wasn't quite at a life stage or a financial situation that it made a lot of sense to go search for a business at that point in time. Mm-hmm. But it was still there in the back of my head as something that I'd want to do longer term. So I went and joined BCG, a big strategy consulting firm, was doing mostly industrials and med tech work, a lot of strategy, M&A, due diligence, organization type work there. And after I was there for 3-4 years, it was getting to the point where I was ready to make a transition, and I was really seriously contemplating looking full-time for a business in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So mid-2021, I left that role and started to do it full-time.
Well, in your time at Cargill and BCG, I mean, you had to have seen such a good variety of just really strong business practices happening, and the dynamics of those two companies, both really growth-oriented companies, had to be great exposure for you.
Yeah, and they both provided two pretty different perspectives on the whole situation or experiences that got me ready for this. So in the role with Cargill, or roles with Cargill, it was much more hands-on manufacturing. So I was actually at a plant in southeastern Iowa. I was doing some engineering projects, but then a good portion of the time I was in charge of part of a department of a production facility, and so had a big team of blue-collar technicians operating the plant, was involved in all the supervision related to that, as well as kind of any optimization and improvement projects there. And then when you contrast that with the BCG experience, that was much more working with the executives at larger corporations, thinking through anything from what does the 10-year strategy look like? How do we enter into this market? Should we develop products to get into it organically? Should we be looking at M&A to get a foothold in the market? How does our organization look? Are we structured in the right way? any sort of like bigger projects that would be top of mind for the senior executives at those companies. So two pretty different lenses to kind of come at this from.
Yeah. And so you were sitting around one day and said, "Hey, I think I want to go buy a company." And I know it didn't happen that way, but kind of take us through the thought process of where you were and then how you decided to build what I'm calling an acquisition playbook. I've built some of those for companies, and it sounds to me a lot similar to the things that I've done, but you approached it in a completely unique way.
Yeah, so I got to the point where I was in a position life-wise and financially that it made sense to set out and do this. My wife and I are both from the Minneapolis area. We knew we wanted to stay in this area longer term just for personal reasons, families in the area, etc. And we wanted to put our roots down and really be kind of part of the community. So that was one piece that was important to us in starting on this journey. And then being exposed to bigger companies and then working with people in pretty senior roles at those companies, I got the opportunity to see what the career progression looks like if that's the path that you want to take. And I think I was looking for something that was a little more control your own destiny. Over time, you can shape both the business how you want it to be, as well as kind of set up the life that we were interested in. And so decided it was the right time to actually go out and start looking for one of these businesses.
And so, if you could talk a little bit more about how you started to put businesses on your target list and started to get deal flow going and really getting into that whole investment banking
Yeah.
mindset of, I want to look at companies and this is the profile. How did you do that?
Yep. So the first part of it was to set out the criteria of the companies that I was looking for. And so, as I mentioned, being commutable from the greater Twin Cities area was one of the first criteria. It had to be in a size range that was big enough that it wasn't effectively buying myself a job and it was buying sort of an ongoing concern or a decent sized company. And then the main targets were kind of within the realm that would work for a SBA, Small Business Administration loan. Because part of the process of purchasing the company would be using a mix of debt and equity to actually complete the transaction. And then I started to put together lists of companies that would be interesting to me, starting with an industry filter. So, given my background in manufacturing and working with industrials companies, the three primary categories I was looking in were light manufacturing, so asset light manufacturing, distributors, wholesalers, and then blue collar service businesses. And that was primarily because they were areas that I was comfortable with, had experience in. I generally like making and doing things in general. And so those fit into my areas of interest. And then started to approach actually finding companies and putting together deal flow in sort of a three-pronged approach. First, putting together a list of any brokers or small investment bankers that might have companies that they're representing in this area. So that could be people local to the Twin Cities, but it could also be national firms that might have companies that they're working with that are in this area. And then the second was to do what I'll call a networked search for a business. So trying to identify people who are active and involved in the small business community in this area, having coffee, lunch, Zoom calls with them just to get to know them a little bit. And so that could be accountants, lawyers, financial advisors, lenders, anyone who's sort of plugged into that community. And each conversation would be sort of, this is my background, this is what I'm doing. At some point, I'm going to need a lawyer or an accounting firm to work with both on the transaction, but then after closing on the business. But then the second half of it was all, do you know anybody who's maybe you work with them and they've mentioned to you that they're interested in selling their business, or do you have referrals to others in the community that might be good to talk to just build out my network and also have sort of similar contacts that might be at the position where they're looking to sell their business. So that's 1 and 2. And then third was I started to put together a proprietary outreach campaign. So summer of 2021, we were still sort of coming out of COVID, and there were pretty good databases with companies that took PPP loans. And so I basically, for the state of Minnesota, took all the data of who had taken PPP loans and then filtered by industry, number of employees, location of the business to put together a list of companies that might be interesting to talk to at least and see if the current owners are at the point where they're considering selling. And so I had a whole basically mass email and outreach campaign scheduled for that. But Eagle Aluminum, the business that I ended up purchasing, we got under LOI with Eagle kind of right as that whole campaign was kicking off. And so didn't end up going down that route too much in practice, but was all set up and ready to go on it.
Well, and I love this because it's a very proactive, and as we talked about before we jumped on this, a systematic approach. And I think so many, I've seen individuals do it where it becomes opportunistic. Somebody wants to sell a business, you kind of, okay, I think I like it, I want to buy it. But I've seen companies do the same thing. In fact, the systemized approach to this is something I think all of our listeners can take away and say, as I'm thinking about acquisitions, I want to do what Tom did and approach it like that. But how many deals did you look at?
Yeah, I wish I had an exact number for you. I'd say I probably reviewed SIMs on somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 500 companies.
Okay.
So NDAs for all those, reviewed the initial sort of investment memo. I think at the end of it, I got down to probably somewhere between 6 and 8 companies that I was pretty serious about, and these were all staggered over a period of time, so not all at one time. And then ended up making offers on either four or five of those companies, and then one went all the way through to the finish line.
Yeah. So again, you're giving yourself, as you're putting these transactions together, you're giving yourself optionality. I don't know if you had a preference about which of the 4 or 5 that you really wanted to run, but it sounds like you could have stepped into any of those companies and taken off.
Yeah, and Eagle, the company I ended up purchasing, is the one I was most excited about. When it came down to it, this was right around Christmas time of 2021. I was negotiating between 2 companies, like pretty heavily, and ultimately had to make a choice of which one I preferred more and wanted to move forward with. And so ended up choosing Eagle from that one and kind of had a really good relationship with the sellers throughout that whole process, and it kind of went from there.
Well, and so then that brings us to really the next big question is, how did you get this thing financed? And because that's another obviously huge part of this.
Yeah, so I was always going into this knowing that there was going to be a big piece of the acquisition that was financed with debt, and that was going to be a combination of bank loan or term loan from a bank, as well as some seller debt, and all those were sort of negotiable throughout the process of getting the deal closed. And then, depending on the size of the company, would have to raise equity as well. And so on the debt side of things, I was initially planning on an SBA loan. For this particular company, it made sense to do a conventional loan, so it was just through a local or regional bank here in town. And then the sellers provided a little bit of debt on the business, and then the rest I raised equity from outside investors. And that was a mix of people who are sort of familiar with this type of investment and have made others similar in these sized companies, as well as kind of higher net worth individuals that I knew either professionally or through my network somehow.
So you went from really running a pretty significant process and really being you've built your network of attorneys and accountants, and people are thinking about you and bringing you deals. You've run through these 300 to 500 SIMs. You've made your 4 to 5 LOIs. You got one. You got the financing in place. You close, and so you move from take your investment banker hat off one day, and you put on your operator hat, your CEO hat, the next day. So talk a little bit about that transition for you.
Yeah, they were very starkly different activities and roles, if you will. I will say throughout the process, the previous owners of the business were very, very good throughout the transition, and it made a world of difference because it allowed me to come in on day one and not immediately have to step into everything. So there were two previous owners. One was kind of in charge of operations, and one was more of the CEO and sales and marketing. And so they stayed in and kind of operated the business as it had been for a period of time while I was getting up to speed. And so I spent the first 6 to 9 months really learning the business and slowly taking over for the owner that was very sales and marketing focused. And then the the operations guy, we ended up hiring somebody to come in and train from him and learn. So there was a pretty gradual transition from the previous owners to kind of me and the team that was in place. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the team that was in place at Eagle was also very strong. And so they were really very welcoming and very kind of accepting of the change and did a lot to help me get up to speed and maintain operations, maintain our marketing efforts, maintain all of our customer service that we pride ourselves on throughout the process, so that I could actually learn the business, begin to take over a lot of the management day to day, and then ultimately at about the 1 year mark, the sellers started to transition out of the business.
Mm-hmm. And was that the fact that you had sellers willing to stay in it through the transition? Was that part of your criteria that you looked at as you decided on which companies to go for? Because it certainly seems like it would be better than someone just handing you the keys and saying, "Great, I need your check and I'm out." So
Yeah, it definitely factored in. So I think one of the biggest things for me when looking at these companies was the level of trust and rapport that I had with the sellers,
yeah,
because I assume this is true of most small and mid-sized businesses, but it's not the same as doing due diligence on a very large company where all of the information is readily available. There's just so many different things to try to figure out and to understand quickly that if you don't have the trust in the sellers, or if you're seeing any sort of red flags, that would be one of the quickest reasons that I would run away. And so in my case, that wasn't the case. I very much trusted the two previous owners. We had talked about a 6 to 12 month transition plan throughout the process. And then as we were negotiating the final parts of the purchase agreement, we landed on a 1 year agreement for each of them so that we covered the transition and had plenty of time for me to get up to speed, because they were both very focused on making sure that the company and the current employees get taken care of longer term, because it's also a big part of their legacy.
Sure.
So,
well, it sounds like it went really well, and here we are, right at about the 2 year anniversary, right? And so
it goes fast.
maybe just talk a little bit about Eagle and some of the successes you've had here in the 2 years you've been here.
Yeah. So Eagle in general, we're a distributor, fabricator, finisher of aluminum extrusions, and most of what we do goes into a wide variety of industries, but some of the bigger ones are architectural millwork, and so a lot of construction and remodel type projects, some into OEM applications, some into data centers, and then a wide variety of other industries. So all of that kind of for the past 15, 20, 25 years, pretty much everything that's come into Eagle has been inbound. There's really been no outbound sales efforts, and it's a testament to some of the marketing, digital marketing that the previous owner and members of our team have done to get it to that point. But one of the things that I really wanted to do when coming in here was to start to not to lessen focus at all on some of these marketing efforts that drive inbound leads. Certainly that's still a huge portion of our business and something we focus on, but also to add to that with an outbound sales team. And so over the past year and a half, really more like year and a half once I got my feet under me in the business, we've started to build out an outbound sales team to start to go after some of the bigger customers in these industries that have purchased from us on smaller scales over the course of the past 10, 15 years, but with a little bit more focus on the relationships and kind of building business with our existing customers, have a lot of opportunity for us. And so that's been an area that's been a good amount of work and also a big amount of learning for me, because it's pretty different than what I was doing prior to purchasing the company, and actually an area where the CEO roundtable has been pretty helpful in talking me through.
Well, it puts you in such a more proactive place of being aggressive about building your sales pipeline versus waiting for the phone to ring or someone to send an email and say, "Hey, we want to buy something," right?
Yeah, exactly right.
It's got to be a huge step for you, for the organization. You talked about the CEO roundtable, and you've been a member for how long now?
A little over a year at this point in time.
So obviously you've brought Eagle a long way in that year's time, and you just talked about the roundtable being helpful. Can you tell us about a big decision or big input that the roundtable had in helping you build Eagle?
Yep. Yeah. So in relation to the building out the sales function, my first attempt at it wasn't the best. I don't think I had a clear vision in terms of, okay, I was going to hire a salesperson to lead this part of the business, and like they were going to go drum up sales, but I didn't have the proper guidance in terms of 20 different industries that we sell into. There's a wide variety of different sizes of customers that we have. And so there wasn't enough thought put into the overall targeting and strategy going into it. And so I brought this to one of our CEO roundtable meetings and kind of prompted the groups as to, told them what I'd done, kind of how I was feeling that we hadn't put enough thought and structure into what our sales strategy was. It was kind of hey, these are our types of customers, put together some of your lists and just start going after it. And so they had great feedback for me in terms of setting the direction from the top, making it clear what the metrics and the pieces that we need to hold our sales leader accountable for, and then helping me talk through what they'd seen in terms of incentive structures and how to kind of drive the right behaviors that you're hoping for throughout that process. And so that influenced a lot of how I was going through hiring a new head of sales for the organization, and I think really helped to put us on the right foot, and it's resulted in some decent growth for us over the past year.
And that's such a great situation for a roundtable to dig into and really help you with and provide their perspective, because most of them are running sales organizations in some way, shape, or form, right? And
Sure.
for you to hear what works for them and what doesn't had to be invaluable.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a wide variety of different industries, different ways people go to market. And so it was curious and insightful to hear how each one of them thought about it within their own organization. And then I could sort of pick and choose what made the most sense for Eagle as
Sure.
we went into it.
Well, now we get to the portion of the show where I ask you some questions about you, so the audience can learn a little bit more about who Tom is. So what's your favorite movie?
Favorite movie? I'm a sucker for sort of sci-fi and fantasy, so probably Interstellar.
Okay. And what are you reading now?
I've always got, I'll call it a for fun and a learning book going. So for fun book right now is Demon Copperhead, which is my wife was telling me that she thinks it's loosely based off David Copperfield, but a guy growing up in Appalachia and kind of tough upbringing and kind of pulls himself out of it. And so about halfway through that right now. And then my learning book is Altered Traits, it's called. But I've gotten, over the past couple of years, I'm a big fan of meditation, and it's just kind of the science behind it and the long-term practice and how it affects the way you're able to manage stress and deal with situations. So I'm finding it pretty interesting as well.
That's good. And then the last one is your bucket list concert.
Yeah, this one's easy. I'm a huge Dave Matthews Band fan, and I've seen him all over the country. But I would love to see them at Red Rocks, which it's been a number of years since they've been there. But if that happens,
You're there, right?
I'm going to be there for sure.
That would be a great show. Well, Tom, this has been fascinating, and I think we could go on and on, because I think the way you built this, your whole process, the way you crafted it, the way you executed it is just fantastic, and I think it's something learning, I think, that anybody thinking about acquisitions, whether individually or with the company they're in, can certainly learn from the process you put together. So thank you for sharing it with us today.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on, Scott.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the CEO to CEO podcast, produced by Dave Swerdlick and the incredible team at Uptown Podcast Studios. You can find them at uptownpodcast.com. Be certain to subscribe so you don't miss an episode with more CEO wisdom highlighting experience and insights from the trenches. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review and share with others. If you are a Minnesota-based business leader who would like to learn more about being part of a peer advisory roundtable, check us out at ceo-roundtable.org.